it might be a good idea to reread the last of the servant songs, because that's what we'll focus on today. I'll put it on the screen, though I suspect you've both got Bibles. Do you want me to read it while you take it in?
Thank you.
Okay. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Just as there were many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. But that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and as one from whom others hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. By his bruises we are healed. For we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish you shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Okay. So I think the last 2 weeks we've been kind of trying to disaggregate, if that's the word, our awareness of this servant figure from identifying with Jesus, trying to look at it from Isaiah's own context, and what it might be saying to the readers and listeners of the text. But tonight, I think we want to kind of to move into the Christian understanding of this. I think last week was really, really useful. I mean, because by just getting the notion that this is telling a story about a real person to whom terrible things are happening, and yet the fact that they are prepared to suffer has had some impact and implication for the community of which they are a part. But as you can imagine, there are quite different interpretations beyond the Isaiah era, and strong divergence between Jewish interpretation and the traditional Christian interpretation. and I think it's caused, it's part of the rift between Judaism and Christianity. I think this passage is not read in the synagogue's lectionary. It's not included, and Jewish scholars think that the reason it's been excluded is because of what they see as this kind of big offensive misinterpretation of the passage, having identifying Jesus as Messiah and the suffering servant, whereas they are identifying the suffering servant as Israel itself, or Jerusalem here, and the suffering in exile and the exile of the peoples, the continuing exile of the Jewish people, and the suffering servant is Israel itself, and perhaps influenced by Christian interpretations, by the Messiah, so with a certain eschatological expectation underlying the interpretation as well. And their justification is that the whole of this section of Isaiah 40 to 55 is about the story of an exiled people and a restored people. It's about exile and restoration. And we've talked in the past couple of weeks about the diverse interpretations of who the servant might be, of whom Jesus is only one possible candidate. And then if you look at, in contrast to the Jewish interpretation, Christian interpretation is that this is prophecy of Jesus, and summarizing it. I mean, I've seen stuff online. I mean, it's really interesting that the evangelical, and I'm increasingly wanting to call it the fundamentalist, the radical fundamentalist Christianity that's we're seeing now so prevalent, is says very clearly this was Isaiah having the foresight and actually predicting Jesus, and actually this was Jesus. Isaiah knew when he was writing that he was writing about Jesus, and this was the sheer genius of Isaiah, who was able to tell fortunes, and how the first Isaiah was able to predict the Babylonian exile, because there was only one Isaiah, and he was clever enough to predict the Babylonian exile, which comes in the second part of the book, and then even cleverer to predict, that Jesus was going to be the servant who would suffer. And that's very strong. But I think more, and I think you probably would understand this, that the more kind of mainstream Catholic and liberal Protestant positions is that any Christological interpretation of the Old Testament is a retrospective perception. The point of the departure is not Isaiah, but it's the apostolic teaching, and the church now starts from the position that this is the apostolic teaching about Jesus, and you can read retrospectively into the Old Testament prophets writing, and so the big question then is, if you like, is how we reconcile a position between the Jewish understanding and interpretation and the Christian understanding, and how we can sort of begin to heal that gap in understanding this passage. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, what strikes me, and I think I may have said this 2 weeks ago as well, but what strikes me is how much these words have influenced our understanding of Jesus. Partly, as I think you mentioned, Vaughan, a couple of weeks ago, by their use in the Messiah, because that's for a lot of people, that's a way in which words get lodged and ideas get lodged in your mind. But just generally, the idea that verse 3, the idea of him bearing our infirmities, carried our diseases. I mean, that's not necessarily how you'd view the Jesus story unless you'd read these verses. So I wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Well, that's not the only way of understanding what happened on the cross. But I think reading these verses have helped subsequent Christians to understand the suffering of Jesus in a particular way, and a substitutionary way, which not all of us would be comfortable with. So I think that's how it's worked. We've sort of read these verses, we've used them to interpret Jesus for ourselves, and then we said, aha, look, they're looking forward to him, because they happen to coincide with what we'd already read from them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it'd be interesting if you hadn't had Isaiah 52 and 53, whether our basic understanding of Jesus would have been different, whether our understanding of Jesus and atonement and everything that follows would have been different, and it might well have been.
I think so. And I mean, we'll look at some passages in a minute from the New Testament, and just to see how that interpretation is not something that has been imposed subsequently, but is actually inbuilt into the apostolic witness, and is integral to the apostolic witness. So it's right from the foundation of Christianity has this passage been deeply influential, and begs the question as to how influential it was to Jesus himself. I mean, it's in some ways, this idea of the 4 servant songs is a very modern idea. It was only this guy Doom, who was a sort of 19th century, early 20th century theologian, biblical critic, identified these 4 songs, and put forward the notion that they were written by the same person, and edited into the book of Isaiah. You can take those out, and it doesn't feel like there's a gap if you just read from what goes before to what comes afterwards. It doesn't feel like the gap. So they're seen as a kind of insertion into the text, and it might be that there's just a bit of space in the parchment, just add a little poem in there, or and also, some people question even whether or not you should call it the suffering sermon, because the writings are as much about exaltation, which is why it fits into Isaiah's narrative of exile and restoration. That this is about a period of suffering, a period of restoration, a period of redemption. So where to go? We don't need to go through what it says, because we dealt with that. Some interesting. Oh, Neil is here. If we start to look at how Neil, how kind of interpretation has moved from the time of Isaiah, we can start with the Septuagint, which is the translation from the Hebrew into Greek, which has had quite an influence on the interpretation. So that first word is servant, see my servant, abdi in Hebrew. It doesn't use the word doulos in the Greek. It uses the word pais. Now, you Graham, will be able to help us here with the Greek, but my understanding is that pais, rather than doulos, means slave, but it also means servant. So in the original Hebrew, there is more of a sense of a slave, but in the Greek, in the Septuagint, there's more of a sense of a servant, a child, or even a son in the word that's used, which has a huge impact, I think, on how the passage is then understood and interpreted and used in the New Testament. Am I talking sense, Graham? Because you're much more knowledgeable than me.
Well, I mean, it sounds sort of plausible, but I haven't, I haven't actually done much work on those passages for a very long time.
Right.
But I mean, I think one thing that I mean, just reading them now is that however you whether you say servant or slave, that's only pointing out a particular role that this person had, and that there are then there's a great deal of things which are in this sort of very rich passage, which which aren't to do with with either of those things. I mean, and one thing you also get here is the idea of disfiguring illness. So marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. And and it's and that could mean so many things. I mean, it could be disfigurement, but it could also be the idea of a radical prophet, that kings shall shut their mouths because of him.
We noticed that. Sorry.
And I think the remarkable thing about this couple of chapters is that it doesn't actually sort of go from here's something about suffering and here's something about transfiguration. It's all really, they're all very closely interwoven through each other, with each other throughout the whole of the passage. And I'm not sure where this leaves us theologically.
Right. Interesting. I mean, we did note last week about the kings just shut their mouths before them, but he, didn't open his mouth. That kind of contrast there. Yeah. But I think if that word, to me, that word servant, as we read it now, emotionally, I connect with it as this kind of Jesus figure who willingly gives himself into suffering, that sort of sense. And if the translation, from in the Septuagint gives more of a nuance on the word servant, and it could be child or even son, then that also kind of has an impact on how we interpret it. So the use of the Greek, and I think there's another word there, which is in verse 12. Verse 12, 12b, because he poured out himself, and that's the kind of links from the Hebrew, but in the Septuagint, the word that's used has more of an understanding of handed over, because he was handed over himself to death, and that word handed over is very significant in the New Testament. Paul, in Romans says he was handed over to death for our transgressions, and also, in Mark, in the story of the trials, and he was handed over. He was handed over to Herod. He was handed over to Pilate. He was handed over to be crucified. That same word is used. So there's a kind of way in which just the interpretation in the translation of the Septuagint has strongly influenced who we are. I think similarly, that going into this really, but there are bits in Daniel as well which are linked, whereas Daniel, rather than putting the emphasis on the suffering, puts the emphasis more on the sort of righteousness and the kind of interpretation of his own era of persecution, and then the servant becoming a more collective character who represents the sort of righteous individuals who resisted the decrees of Antiochus IV. So it doesn't refer to vicarious suffering, but it does interpret the servant as being more about these righteous individuals who stand up, which is a little bit the way in which we were reading it last week, actually. Reading the servant as a righteous individual who had stood up to oppression. But I think maybe we can just shift screens, and if you've got the Bible text with you, we can do it this way. I mean, what I've done is I've just put a whole load of passages from Scripture, which from the New Testament, and we can kind of cross-reference and see what we can learn about the way in which the passage does influence, as you say, Peter, does influence that. I've just quoted that one. Romans 4, but let's just read. Somebody like to read Romans 5, 15 to 19, and then we'll have a look at another couple of little verses. So the question is whether how much Paul is using this Isaiah passage in his own interpretation and understanding and Christological, his Christology. I mean, his understanding of Christ and the person of Christ.
I'll read it.
Yeah. Thanks.
But the free gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died through the one man's trespass, much more surely have the grace of God and the free gift in the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for the many. And the free gift is not like the effect of the one man's sin. For the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brings justification. If, because of the one man's trespass, death exercised dominion through that one, much more surely will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness exercise dominion in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Therefore, Just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. For just as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous.
Do you feel echoes of the theology of suffering servant in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the idea that it's the choice of the one person to be a free gift. And that keeps coming, doesn't it? That phrase is said 4 times there. And is that servanthood? I wonder. It's a type of servanthood, but I think the challenge that I would have with this is a servant doesn't really have choice. Whereas a free gift is about choice. And, obviously a slave has even less choice. But, a servant does what they do because there's some payment in effect for what they've done, whether that's money or otherwise.
I mean, it's quite fundamental to Paul that, that the fall of Adam is redeemed through the
absolutely. Yeah.
Through the sacrifice of Christ. I mean, that what as one man gave death, and even so in Christ gave all shall be made alive. I mean, whether or not this sense of there being a sort of sacrifice, something sacrificial, in the same way that the servant is seen as being sacrificial, the lamb led to the slaughter.
I think there's a whole political and cultural background to all of this that's difficult to disentangle from this, really, because is the idea of servant being reinforced so that those who are servants feel better about being servants? Is that a political aspect of it? Do we have a different cultural understanding now of what servanthood is from what used to be the case, and therefore we can't fully get what's being talked about by Isaiah referring to servant? What is the servant, in a sense, in the older culture, more free to make choices than perhaps we think? Because in some ways, I suppose it's ironic, but the limitation of choice in that you are who you are and that's it for life kind of then allows you a little bit more freedom within that. I don't know. It's a very difficult one to disentangle. And I learned a lesson on this. Sorry, so there's a slight tangent, but I think it's quite relevant, actually. One of my jobs is I'm chief examiner for an ESOL qualification, and I was talking to some people in Greece yesterday where they're doing the qualification. And what I found really interesting in an exam, we had used the word phobia, which, was a Greek word. I didn't think there'd be a problem, but apparently in Greece it doesn't exist anymore.
Okay.
It's not a concept they have. And I just found, that just kind of blew my mind. It's a tiny thing in a way, but we can make assumptions sometimes about the language and think that we know what it means. But I wonder if we really know what this servanthood actually means in Isaiah.
Well, I think the answer is very simple to that, Neil. I mean, we just don't know.
Oops. Sorry. Bashed the table too hard.
Graham.
And I think also that, in both these passages, in Isaiah and in Romans, you get a lot of talk about things which happen to people and which assign them to some sort of pattern of life or other. Like, here you have the free gift. And it's not just something which happens but after having got the free gift, then the person's life changes. But also, then conversely, you've got the trespass and condemnation. And that similarly is goes through all of the place. And you know, just looking at both these passages, um, um, what's striking me as well is that you know, just how much variation there is in all of this. You know, it's not just putting people on, you know, there are lots of different trajectories and they interact in, you know, very complex ways. And,
Paul loves balance, doesn't he?
yeah,
He loves things to be complete. You know, it shows here. He loves if this has happened on the one hand, this has to happen on the other hand, and the two weigh up against each other. And that's very much his approach in a lot of his letters, I think.
But also, I mean, what you see here is this contrast between, you know, the fall of Adam, then so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification of life, and I think that where I think he's drawing on the understanding of the servant as being the righteous one, you know, who does the self-sacrificial deed, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, just to quickly.
Just one thing about
Sorry, go on.
It's interesting because the Jewish understanding of the fall is not Paul's understanding there.
Exactly.
Is that Adam's fall is just represents the wrong choices we all make. So that the song that goes, "Lord, forgive Adam, for Adam is me," that's exactly what they believe. There's something passed on, whereas this clearly seems to be reading it differently, much more like original sin. Original sin. And so I sort of wonder whether Paul's understanding of what Adam does is influenced by his interpretation through this passage, maybe, of what Jesus did, but it's certainly not a Jewish understanding, which has only really just struck me reading that.
And of course, Augustine is influenced by Paul.
Yeah.
Particularly by Romans, you know.
And Luther too.
Yeah.
And is Paul, and this may be completely wrong, it's pure speculation, but is Paul more influenced by a Socratic way of thinking, a kind of a philosophical approach which is outside the Jewish tradition? Well,
he's both, isn't he? I mean, he is both the rabbi and also the person who comes from Tarsus, you know.
Yes.
You know, with all of the exiled philosophers living in Tarsus at the time. So.
And I'm not saying that's therefore wrong, but it's another layer that is beyond what's in Isaiah.
Right.
Yeah,
because it's coming from a different cultural, philosophical understanding.
Just to move on a bit.
Could I just put a footnote to Paul? It's also worth looking at the Stoics.
Yeah.
As well as, you know, as well as Socrates and Plato and so on.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah.
So I mean, just interestingly, in Romans, he twice quotes the servant Psalms, just, you know, in 10:16, but not all have obeyed the good news. For Isaiah says, "Lord, who has believed our message," which comes from the servant Psalm, and similarly he's written 15:21. But as it is written, those who have never been told of him shall see, and those who have never heard of him shall understand. That's also. So these little clues, you know, that he knew the servant songs and he was drawing upon them and quoting from them. So it's not at all unreasonable to believe that influences his understanding, his Christology, his understanding of Christ. Just rushing through these, but I mean, this is quite interesting how somebody got a Bible there. Yeah. Okay. So if I read the Mark passage, the synoptic passage, and then somebody just read the equivalent verse, and then we get this. We'll do it quickly, and then get the sense of how the servant song is interwoven into the synoptic story. So, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it a race?
Yeah. Let's start. Mark 14. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many.
And then 53:12 and Isaiah says, therefore I'll give him a share with the many. He'll share out the numerous as spoil in return for the fact that he exposed his person to death, when he let himself be numbered with the rebels, when he was the one who carried the wrongdoing of many people and was appealing for the rebels.
And then in Mark 14 and 15, but he was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed.
He was put down, but he was the one who let himself be afflicted. And he wouldn't open his mouth, like a sheep that's led to slaughter, or like a ewe that's silent before its shearers, he wouldn't open his mouth.
I think, yeah. Have I got the right verse there? Just let me just check, because I think
There's my translation throwing you. This is the I forgot what it's called. It's one that John Golding and Tom Wright came up with.
okay, all right. I think also that little passage relates to, so he shall startle many nations, kings shall shut their mouths because of him. Yeah. Oh no, that's a bit later.
Yeah, I think that's next.
Yeah, that's my mistake. Right. Okay, Mark 14:65 and Mark 15:19. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. The guards also took him over and beat him. They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him.
I gave my back to people striking me, my cheeks to people pulling out my beard. I didn't hide my face from deep disgrace and spit. Right.
And then Mark 15, but Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God.
So he'll spatter many nations. Okay. At him kings will shut their mouths, because what hadn't been told them they will have seen, and what they hadn't heard they will have understood.
And then this passage, I didn't put it down because it's so long, but I'll read it. Mark 15, 6-15. 15. It's not one of those Bibles where the pages are so thin you can never turn from one page to the other.
Is that reference right? Because chapter 53 doesn't have 16 verses.
I was just looking at that.
I think maybe you meant 12, didn't you?
What have I put? 53.
You put 53, 16, and 12, but there is no 16.
I'm sorry. I'm a disaster.
Our passage, we may have to find which verse that was meant to be. That'd be our challenge.
Okay, there's your homework.
Yeah.
53, is it 6?
Maybe it's 6. Would that make sense?
Or we like sheep who've gone astray. Anyway, no, I don't think it is.
No. Well, 12 certainly works, I should think. Well, we've already read that one, actually.
Anyway, I'll read this passage and then you can work out which. Now at the festival he used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? For he realized it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over, you see. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again, and what do you wish me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews? They shouted back, crucify him. Pilate asked him, why, what evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed them over to be crucified. And what is Isaiah 53:12?
12, we've had this, but it's therefore I'll give him a share with the many. He'll share out the numerous as spoil in return for the fact that he exposed his person to death when he let himself be numbered with rebels, when he was the one who carried the wrongdoing of many people and was appealing for the rebels.
Yeah, I think it's also verse 9. I think they made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich.
Yes, that's right. Okay.
Although he'd done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yeah. And then similarly, and with them they crucified two bandits, one on his right, one on his left. That goes back to verse 12. Yeah. And then he was numbered with the transgressors there. Yeah. And then when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. And then from Luke, again 53:12, I tell you the scripture was fulfilled in me, and he was counted among the lawless, and indeed what is written about me is being fulfilled. So you get these overtones of the resonances of this servant song in the narrative of the synoptic gospels. I mean, most of those were from Mark, but they're in the parallels as well. And then just quickly look through these and see specific mention, in Matthew in relationship to healing, which is Graham was talking about that earlier. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. So Jesus' healing ministry was related to that. And then in Luke, for I tell you, this scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was counted among the lawless. Indeed, what is written about me is being fulfilled. In John, this was to fulfill the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And then, famous passage in Acts. Now, the passage of the scripture that he was reading, this is the Ethiopian eunuch, was this: like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. And then in Romans, we've seen that quote already, those two quotes. And then in 1 Peter, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. That's all. So you see this. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I mean, when you put those verses together, you begin to see that this is ingrained in the New Testament text. It clearly was an incredibly influential poem that was informing the writing, to the witness and the understanding and the interpretation of Jesus. Someone said Isaiah's fingerprints are everywhere in the New Testament.
But of course, the people that wrote the Gospels and Paul's letters had a vested interest in making that point, because they were trying to prove that Jesus was in their understanding the foretold Messiah. So it was in their interest to find passages in the Old Testament that would back up what they were trying to say. So I guess, I mean, it's really difficult. I mean, I guess we can say that they had in their eyes, legitimate purpose for using Isaiah, even in ways that we would feel might be unfair to its original intention. If you see what I mean.
I do, but I'm not sure that it is quite as mechanical as that. That it is. We've got. I mean, I think that a lot of modern biblical interpretation is based on a kind of assumption of deceit in some way. If I'm saying what I think correctly, I mean that I think these people were living within, the scriptures. I mean, they were alive to the scriptures, and they were just as we would. If you write a sermon, you see something, in the text which speaks directly to something that you read in the newspaper, or
Yes,
whatever.
exactly.
And it was doing that for them. And when you have this figure, Jesus, who in the sort of heat of that time, actually confronts the oppressive power with something as radically alternative to that, and then ends up being crucified. And in whatever way we understand it, resurrection, I mean, so that you get this sense of the text coming alive, in another person, and yeah, he is our suffering servant, he is our servant, whoever the servant was for Isaiah, he is ours, and we tell the story with those resonances deliberately, and maybe Jesus himself, had that understanding of himself, that not that I am the Messiah, but that I have to suffer in the way that this character in Isaiah is suffered for the same reason. I have to suffer because that will have an impact on the whole of society and the whole of the human situation that he found himself in. I don't know if that makes sense.
I agree.
Sorry.
Intending to deceive. No, definitely.
Yeah.
But I also don't think the things are mutually exclusive. I mean, I think, the people who are writing the Gospels predominantly come from a Jewish background, and they've been convinced that Jesus is the natural outworking of their own faith. And so they're going to look back for clues. Well, where is that then? There's the faith response, but then the mind gets involved and finds the evidence as well. And I don't think that means that it's any less than. In fact, I think it was the reverse. It's like it's been planted there for them to find on the basis of their faith. But I think there's also an expediency, and again, I don't think this is mutually exclusive, in that they're kind of going, look, we are justified in what we're saying because it's been there all along, and you guys need to know this and stop attacking us. I think that's valid too, as well as the cultural context of what's going on at the time when they're writing, and relating some of the apocalyptic visions to what the Romans are doing and what's going on around them. That's totally natural. So I think all of it intertwines, and I think that actually strengthens the thread rather than weakens it.
Yeah, and I think if you look at if you think of the situation at the time where there were a lot of Jewish people, and they all a lot of them had very quite different political and theological agendas, and they would have all have been reading the same Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
So that for each sort of significant verse in that Bible, you would have lots of different conflicting interpretations of that verse. And and then when Jesus says something about that verse, he is saying this and not that. And I think probably it's I mean, probably a lot of that is lost, but the style of this, these confrontations with what Jesus is saying or what Paul is saying, there's obviously a background there.
Yeah.
Can I just, before we go, just share something else with you, because I think this is interesting. This is from Ignacio Ellacuria, who was one of the 7 Jesuit priests who was assassinated in El Salvador. And he wrote this: the traditional reading of the servant as a prefiguration of Jesus' passion should not close our eyes to their power as a real description of the vast majority of humanity today. For him, the suffering servant today is anyone who discharges the mission described in the songs, anyone unjustly crucified for the sins of human beings, whose suffering produces the kind of expiation through its demand for a public and historical return to righteousness and justice.
Gosh.
And that to me is quite consistent with the idea that, you know, that we were talking last week, the possibility that this is talking about a person, you know, whoever edited Isaiah or wrote this song knew about, and that knew the influence that this person's death had had on their contemporary situation, with the idea that Jesus is the servant who suffers on behalf of others, and other people today, you know, play that role of the suffering servant in humanity, in human history. And this other, from somebody called Mary Frances Rees: where is the suffering servant to be found today? In Flint, Michigan? Did African American teens fearing to be shot by the police, in refugees in search of a home, in immigrants living in fear of deportation, in the homeless and the hungry. And that's, you know, I think that quote is.
I just took photographs of the quotes. I didn't take photographs of your faces, just to.
Right.
I just wanted to give an emphasis. But it's really interesting and very ironic, because Ola Curia, he, in a sense, became what he was writing about.
Yeah.
I mean, once he was assassinated, once he was killed.
Of course. Yeah.
He's a living embodiment of.
Exactly.
Yes.
Very powerful quotes. Very powerful quotes. Thank you.
Yeah. But they are, I mean, I think the, you know, the power of the song really is in its fluidity, you know, and it you know, the fact that it is able to be interpreted and understood in different contexts, in different ways, and speak very powerfully, as we've seen, speak very powerfully to Babylonian exiles, to Daniel, you know, to Jesus, you know, and I guess throughout, I mean, certainly powerfully to Christians over, you know, 2,000 years of Good Friday services and powerful liturgies and important Christological, you know, understandings, Paul as well, and then, as we saw, I mean, in a real tough situation in Latin America, with the low intensity conflict and the violence, you know, of the death squads, and now today in, you know, the experience of racism and so on in modern society. I mean, this just speaks, you know, and whoever this servant is, I mean, the servant is universal in some way. Well done, Mr. Isaiah.